Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works. All right, her new collection of essays, Everything and Nothing at All, Jennie Heijun Wills, is here in the studio. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
My pleasure. So I'm very curious about kind of process, and I want to know about the research phase for this book and what that looks like for you, because it seems to me that maybe each essay is a vastly different experience in terms of the research phase. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I love starting off with this question because I feel like with my first book, which was the memoir, people were saying, there's no research in this at all, but it was just sort of below the level of text. But in this text, you're absolutely right. It's a little bit more apparent. My style of research, though, is maybe it evidences how and why I ran away from academic writing. And that's because I don't really feel like a natural researcher myself. And so what tends to happen is based on topic, I'm writing the sort of personal life experience pieces, and then I'm looking up and I'm researching as I go. Quite frankly, a lot of these things. That said, I do believe as a creative writer that reading is a significant part of our research. And so I am doing that, but maybe it's not in the traditional sense.
So then the reading you're doing, is that like oriented around these topics because they're personal? Like you're already doing that kind of reading?
It's more in the sense of these are the kinds of beautiful books I love to read. And so how can I, try in some way to be a part of these conversations, but also how can I reflect the kinds of aesthetics I like in reading? How can I push some of the boundaries? How can I mimic some of them? And so it's more like, I guess, just an admiration and a love of reading that, luckily for me, is my research.
Yeah, that makes sense in an essay like Nightingale, where like obviously you're writing about diasporic kind of writings, but like I was thinking more around the research around like there's like academic references, right? Like there's journal references around like studies on like adoption or on like nutrition and like things like that. Are those the ones where when you're writing it, you're like, oh, now I have to kind of go back and infill with research?
Sometimes,
okay.
Yes, absolutely. And on some of the topics, especially around, food disorders or around different kinds of, I guess, neurological experiences, yes, I do deliberately go in and do research for those kinds of things. When it comes to references about adoption and race, I feel like those are already a little bit at my fingertips, if only because in my previous life, I was a scholar of critical adoption studies. And so it's not so much, actively searching out sources, but saying, oh yeah, my friend wrote this book, or like, I remember this particular perspective on the issue. And then I return to some of those things.
So it was like not fresh research, but kind of like drawing on what was in the back of your head kind of?
It's amazing if you actually learn to trust the sort of art chambers of your mind, what can be archived back in there. So yeah. Have
you learned to trust those art chambers?
I'm getting there,
okay.
I think. Or something like a book like this reminds one that, you do have like a history and a path of the places your mind has gone.
Mm-hmm. So these are obviously like indications of which chambers of your brain there are. Which one came first? Like obviously they're presented in a like ordered way, but like what came for you?
Yeah. So in this collection of essays, 2 of the essays were inspired by short form pieces that I had published elsewhere. And that was the first piece. So the essay that's now called Pretty. That was about aesthetics and fashion and beauty. And then the essay that you were referencing, Nightingale. But it was the small sections about language that were taken from elsewhere. So those came earlier, if only because those were kind of the topics that people had asked me to write about or reflect on earlier. And then the other pieces were sort of filled in to supplement different, not necessarily gaps, but invitational spaces, let's say, in the story.
If you hadn't been asked to do those first 2, would you have written about these topics in that way?
I think so, especially the one about aesthetics, because I was really struck with my first book how much people focused on not just literary aesthetics, but also my physical appearance. And it was curious to me because I guess I had always been thinking about physicality and the visibility of being a transracial and transnationally adopted person, always being quite visible and quite stared at, especially in my youth. Mm-hmm. And so it dawned on me, I started to think a lot about how I deliberately started to curate that image, to be a little bit ostentatious, to try to say to myself in my childhood or in my young adulthood, well, they're looking at me because of the way that I'm wearing my hair or because of the way that I'm doing my makeup or the clothes that I've put on. And so it was a natural sort of transition from thinking about adoption reunion to some of the things that had impacted how I live in the world. And the looks was really one of them. Yeah.
That it wasn't just like aesthetics or ornamentation, that like it was the you that they were seeing?
I think so, or a version of
like
me.
what they were inferring of you. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I thought, if there's this narrative that pre-exists me, not just this adoption narrative, this assumption of what's happened, in my infancy and what's happened in my childhood and whatnot, and what happened to my biological family, but if there's this narrative that already exists, what can I do to try to regain some of that agency in creating what that story is? And aesthetics just seems to be something that I've always been drawn to. I wanted to be a visual artist when I was young. And so thinking about, appearance and performativity seemed like a very natural move for me.
I think you referred to it maybe in the introduction as your therapist saying is like a shilling.
Yes. Shilling it on the street.
Yes, that was the term. Yeah.
Yes.
Like, I am curious about kind of like whether that is a representation of self or like a guard against true representation of self.
I think it's a little bit of both. For me, it's the cynical part of it could say, if you're going to tell your story, you might as well make a buck off of it. If it's going to be so spectacular, you might as well benefit in some way from it. But on the other hand, I think that coming to creative writing and trying to have some sort of agency and control over how I'm presented in the world has actually been identity finding for me.
So this is like in reaction to like people are already going to think something or say something about you, and so controlling the narrative in some way gives you agency.
Yeah, it's like some version of you can't fire me, I quit. It's like you can't look at me, or if you're looking at me, I'll give you something to look at, kind of thing. As naive as I think that, I understand it to be not the healthiest approach or the most critical approach to dealing with those things, but it's what I've been doing for a long time.
An approach for sure.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you hesitate at all about like withholding or keeping something back for yourself, like when you're writing so personally?
Mm-hmm. I try to represent these experiences from my perspective. I never speak on behalf of anyone else, especially not the younger people in my life. But one way that I try to navigate the ethics of those things is to remember that even in nonfiction, even in life writing, we're still creating characters, and our speaker is still an invented, narrator or protagonist that's representing, in my case, herself in a certain way. And the most interesting characters, be it in fiction, poetry, drama, and in nonfiction, are those that are multifaceted and they're nuanced. And so even when I'm approaching complicated, difficult, challenging, and sometimes, conflictual issues, I try to treat all of my characters as non-archetypal, not entirely bad, not entirely good, but with humanity.
So the Jennie that lives on the page, how like, and I think of this as just in my own, I don't think that necessarily other people see me the way I see myself in my head, and the narrative that I have about myself in my head. Are you trying to reach the Jennie that's in your head and represent them on the page, or is there a schism or some sort of divide between those two things?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to reach into real life Jennie's philosophies and ideas about life, definitely her experiences, but the way that I'm representing it is certainly strategic. And as you asked earlier, are there things that you hold back? It's definitely through literary craft that I am withholding in some cases, or overly sensational in other cases, because this is still an exercise in creative craft and in creative expression. But yeah, I certainly hold certain things back, represent her in a particular way. And I think it's different from essay to essay as well. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, some of the pieces feel very academic because they have, footnotes and bibliography and direct citations and do literary analysis. That's the particular character that's showing up there. And so when I talk to my own students in nonfiction writing, I say, we take it for granted that there will be endnotes or a bibliography in certain kinds of writing, but what kind of speaker wants you to know that they've read all of those things? And so it's an important choice to make.
In the introduction, you talk about the academic writing, and ultimately you say, knowledge, too much knowledge can be a damning thing, right? And I get this too, right? Where it's I sometimes wish ignorance maybe is bliss, or at least you can skate through life. Whereas if you know a lot of things, I think you're more you have a higher propensity for anxiety or depression,
it's possible,
right?
Yeah.
If you looked at the real world critically, of course you have fears about life. But what I wanted to kind of get back to is the academic writing, and that the knowledge gatekeeping that happens in academic writing. And this is something I've encountered on campus here, where it's there's people doing research that I think is universally applicable, but no one understands it because it's written in this obscuritist writing. Is that something that you push at purposely in this book?
Not purposely, but I agree that a lot of systems in the Institute of so-called higher education are designed to maintain a kind of status quo that keeps marginalized voices away from the center. Just the very system of peer review, I think, is something that we can all agree on. Takes as an assumption whom we consider a peer to begin with, right? So as you say, it's a little bit gatekeeping. I don't deliberately try to reject those kinds of things. They just don't necessarily, how can I say, align with the ways that my thoughts express themselves in my mind and also on the page. It feels quite alien to me, and so I was so happy to find creative writing as a way to work through some of these things. So I do have this kind of very formal, traditional, maybe arcane training, and creative writing has become an outlet and more of a homecoming to express those ideas in a way that's more comfortable.
Yeah, there's some structural things that you do that are kind of playful, or push against kind of how you think something like this should be structured. How intentional was that? Was that right there from the beginning when you were writing these things, or did that come through editing?
Absolutely. Arrangement is something that I've been thinking about a lot in this collection and in the project that I'm working on right now, even more so. And I think that it's such an exciting way to yes, push against the boundaries, but also just explode them or reveal the shortcomings of genre altogether. And so maybe some of the things that you're referencing are different arrangements or placements on the page, or different kinds of nonlinearity in the text. One thing that I learned that was quite astounding, because I read the audiobook for this collection.
You yourself did the reading?
Did,
Okay.
Are the unique ways that then audiobook producers and directors think about how unique sort of placements on the page can be navigated in that way. And that was so cool to learn. And I can't wait to be writing something with now that knowledge in mind.
So the way they see a break or a transition on the page and how they arrange that to be read is maybe not how you read it in your head as you were writing it?
Absolutely. Or I didn't even consider it. So for instance, in the first essay, Pretty, there are some sections where there are just these sort of blocks of memory that are kind of sporadically appearing, placed on the page. And, of course, when you read that or you see it visually on the page, it indicates something. It indicates fracture. It indicates disorder, whatever. But the audiobook producer said, how can we mimic that effect, because you're trying to get to a certain kind of aesthetic reaction by having it look that way. How can we mimic that by sound? And they came up with this really cool idea to have the voice coming from different parts or different sort of
so like
spatial
different
areas.
Left or right in the channels of stereo and stuff.
Exactly, or adding echo and all of these kinds of cool tricks that I hadn't considered and I'm definitely thinking about now.
That's interesting because reading it, I of course have the advanced reader's copy, so like it's not necessarily how it'll look in the finished copy, but to me it felt like you'd written a bunch of Post-it notes and then like collated them, right? Like where you have like very short kind of thoughts and then you're trying to like piece them together in some sense.
I think that's how my brain works, to be honest. I get these kind of bursts of ideas and usually it's around image or like the sound of a word. And then my editors usually are so kind as to say, this is maybe where the reader might need an anchor to realign themselves and to make sense of everything. And so I do very, very heavily rely on the brilliance of my editors to guide me in that way. But certainly my memory works in short sort of flashes like that.
So speaking of your editors, Hilary Lowe.
Yes.
Was one of them. And in the acknowledgments, you said, thanks for asking me the tough questions.
Yes.
I'm curious what those questions look like. What are tough questions in that process?
Yeah. So I have two extraordinary editors on this book, Martha Kenya Forstner, with whom I worked on the first book, who is, I think, one of her many, many, many skills is being able to see the thing that you're actually talking about in the book and then telling you so that you can deliberately draw those pieces out in the editing process. And she's also she's such a genius when it comes to ordering text and bringing chapters together. This collection started off as 9 essays and now it's down to 5. And she was able to visualize how they could be brought together in certain ways that were making arguments that I'm only just realizing now as I'm starting to talk about the book after the fact. So that's her total influence and inspiration here. Hilary is a Chinese-Canadian individual, and I think it's very special for writers of color and or Indigenous writers, queer writers, etc., to have editors or members on their team who are asking questions from within community. And so some of the difficult questions that Hilary would ask me were things like, I get this, but am I the reader? Or am I the only reader? Like, how can this appeal to us, Hilary, me, whomever, within community, and also others? And so I just thought that was such a helpful perspective to have, and one that I'm sure many other writers in my circumstance are envious of.
Is she asking you to consider audience or message? Like, is she asking you to think like who the reader is or what you're saying to get to an imagined reader, whether they're within community or without?
I think mostly she's asking about intended audience.
Okay.
And the sly ways that we gesture to our own communities so that we can keep their interest and not be, just pandering to an audience that isn't us, but also how we can be slightly informing but not becoming that sort of educationally burdened individual, what we want to hold back, what is just for us, what is something that we're assuming that everyone knows to be fact. And so she was asking wonderful, wonderful questions. And it also helps that she's from a different generation than I am. She's I don't know, chronically cool young person and has a finger on the pulse of, I don't know, Gen Z or like the culture, up and coming culture. And so it was wonderful working with her.
TikTok, not IG.
Exactly. Or something even that's not
even
TikTok
newer than
now.
TikTok.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's making me more anxious. You mentioned there was 9 essays and now there's 5. were the other 4 like abandoned, or were they incorporated into these 5?
So 2 of the essays became the essay called Rainbow. So I originally had one essay that was solely about transracial and transnational adoption, and one essay that was about polyamory and pansexuality. They became one. And this is, again, a testament to Martha's vision, with what she isn't telling me ever. She's not bossy, and she's not saying, well, this is why you have to do this. It's something that she allows me to realize afterwards, or has the faith in me that I'll at some point figure out. When those 2 essays came together, the more I think about it, I'm realizing, what they're both doing, what those 2 examples are doing is revealing some of the shortcomings of the idea of rainbow family, in the sense that for transracial adoption families, rainbow family is used as this kind of liberal catch-all, or this white savior kind of narrative. In queer families, we certainly know this idea of chosen family. And while there are definite, possible benefits in both cases, the risk, I think, that I'm trying to unpack is seeing that as the end result, or the goal of both of these hopefully critically engaged positionalities. And so those were 2 separate chapters that came together. A couple were just sort of completely X'd out. The conclusion now is only maybe a full page long. It originally was a 50-page chapter.
Really?
And so some things just end up away.
Was that her asking you to pare down?
It was, in this case, one of my editors saying, I think you've already said this.
So that 50 pages had already been addressed in like the 200 previous pages?
Exactly. Kind of? And it was, even though it wasn't repetitive, and it was also just another example of showing, I think she rightly said, just leave it for your reader to figure out. Yeah.
Did you see the connection between the adoption and polyamory that became Rainbow beforehand? Or
Absolutely
you would
not.
hive those off into 2 essays because you saw them as distinct?
Absolutely. And I certainly did not see them as connected. And it was the essay that I struggled the most with. And perhaps it's the one that's the most research heavy, or that feels the most research heavy for me. And it's likely that was also part of the challenge for me. But piecing it together felt least organic in the act of writing. But now that I'm thinking about and talking about this book, it seems like the most evocative bringing together of all of the essays.
When you say struggled the most with like to write it, or to like wrap your head around it?
I think it's both,
Yeah.
but yes, just the act of writing. I'm a very fast writer, and it took me maybe 2 weeks to write that full essay, which is long for me.
And was that like a linkage that she saw and said, this needs to be together? Or like, how did that come about?
I'm not sure. She just said, I feel that these 2 are in conversation with one another. And this is one of the ultimate generosities of Martha Cana Forstner, is that she never tells you what you need to know. She's so wise and so generous that she just gives you the pieces and then stands back and lets you figure it out, and then maybe feel smart about yourself. I don't know.
It's interesting to find out that was a couple different things and then put together, because it makes me think of the Japanese practice of kintsugi, like taking the broken pieces of pottery and like using gold to like mend them so they become something beautiful and different that wasn't there in the first place.
That's lovely. Yeah.
And that seems to be kind of a process you've gone through, like socially or like, emotionally.
Right. And in fact, the cover art for the hardback of my first book was Korean quilting. The same designer made both of these covers, Terry Nemo. And in that case, she did Korean quilting as, I guess, the same idea, this sort of idea of like scraps maybe, or the end bits, or possibly thrown away things assembled into something whole and maybe beautiful, maybe not, but possibly functional.
How much say do you have on the cover art?
This is an interesting question. So I received in all three cases. So I've had three different cover art. So two for the memoir. This is the cover that I've received for the hardback of this text. The way that it worked for me is I received the cover art or the jacket or some ideas that way. And it is always shocking to me because you know how in one's own mind you're just like, well, this is clearly a purple book, or this is definitely, ecru, this book. I don't know. Do other people think
it's
that
funny.
way?
I just talked to another author and they were talking about like colors representing specific things, and it was purple and blue was the new one, and it was vastly different than the red of the previous book, right? Like that they saw it.
Yeah. So in my mind, I guess I'm the same way. I think about what I feel is the color of a book. And then the cover is never what I anticipate. And I'm alarmed, but it's not alarmed in a negative way. It's alarmed, I think, by the fact that someone has made something beautiful out of something that like maybe inspired by something that I've done. And it's so humbling for that to happen. I do know authors who push back sometimes or who don't like it, and that's totally their prerogative. Mm-hmm. For me, I trust other artists, and I think it's a tremendous gift for an artist to put something together for you. Mm-hmm. And I also trust, marketing teams. I'm not going to lie, right? Sure. So what do I know about these things? My taste in book covers maybe is old-fashioned. I don't know.
Yeah. I get it. As for the title, was this always the title, or did you wrestle with that?
It wasn't. It was the original title, and then I switched titles, and then I came back to this title, and it was inspired by. I did an interview with a literary journal in the U.S. For my memoir, and the interviewer was also an adopted individual. And just like I'm sure you can imagine when one is interviewed by someone from the same racial community or someone from queer community or someone from, in this case, adoptee community, the questions are just different, mm-hmm. right? And one can take for granted a certain baseline of knowledge. And that's what this interview was like. And so this individual was adopted, and she was asking me questions that no other interviewer had asked me. She asked, what does family mean to you? Point blank. What does blood mean to you? Point blank. What does nationality mean to you? These kinds of questions that we know are provocative and possibly triggering. And my answer for each of these questions at the start was, it means everything, but also nothing at all. And it made me think about, what does it mean to have such a paradoxical understanding of these things that a lot of people hold quite dear to their sense of identity? And so it was that sort of clear sort of a pariah or like distinction or juxtaposition, I don't know, that made me think, there's something here that I think is unique. And for me, it was providing the intellectual context from which my whole opinion on Reunion had been built.
So it was a spur of the moment response to this interviewer, mm-hmm. but like they were tapping into something like intrinsic, in that you were like, wait, I've just spoken a truth here.
Exactly. And if you keep saying something over and over again, or find yourself repeating the same thing over and over again, it must mean something, right? Yeah.
It sounds like the relationship with this interviewer, like the fact that they were able to ask things, it's kind of the way you write about meeting a polyamorous person, that like you're able to have this like relaxation into the questions because you can kind of get past some of the like preliminary like sussing each other out part.
Kind of. There's a little bit of an exhale, I think. On the other hand, it could go completely in the other direction, right? Sometimes it's the people who are closest to us in experience who can really, dig deep inside of you. So there's always that risk as well, I think. But you're right. When I think about polyamory, queer kinship, all of those things, there is, and also communities of color, there's a bit of an exhale. I laugh about the ways that when you're in a group of solely people of color and or Indigenous people, for instance, like the tone of the conversation can sometimes be different. The laughter is different than it sometimes is.
The book is Everything and Nothing at All, out through Knopf Canada. Jennie, thanks very much for coming in and talking about it, and congratulations on its release.
Thank you so much for having me.